Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter, the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, March 17th, and we will hear advancing large-scale climate resilient projects through planning and financing, the HUD DOT perspectives. For content questions related to the presentation, just type those in their Q&A box at any time. We will answer those at the end of the presentations during the Q&A. It would be helpful if you have a particular panelist that you would like to answer the question. Please put that in your question. That just helps speed up our process at the end when we're in the middle of the Q&A. If you have any technical questions, again, just type those in the Q&A box and I'll do my best to answer those. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our sponsoring APA chapters and divisions for 2023. Thanks to all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today, we are sponsored by a joint division effort, part of the Sustainability and Resiliency series, which you'll hear a little bit more about in a moment. On your screen is a list of our next 3 upcoming webcasts. You can register for these and all of our upcoming sessions at ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Today's session is worth 1.5 CM credits, 1 of the Sustainability and Resilience credits. You can log those by heading over to planning.org, log into your My APA account, and from there you can either search by today's title or event number, both of which can be found on our website, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. If you're on social media, be sure to like us on Facebook. Just search Planning Webcast Series and we'll pop up. That's where I post any important date or time changes, when new sessions are available for you to register for, and the weekly reminder of this Friday's session. And also head over to YouTube, again, type in Planning Webcast Series. Will pop up along with our well over 400 session recordings. All of our sessions, including today's, are available on our YouTube channel for free. So be sure to head over there and subscribe to our channel so you get notified when new sessions have been added. That's it for my intro. Again, as you come up with any questions, just type those into the Q&A box and we'll get to them at the end during the designated Q&A time. I am now going to turn it over to you, Carla, to kick things off and introduce today's session and panelists and all that good stuff.
All right. Have you allowed me to share, Christine? Okay. All right. Is everybody seeing that? I hope so.
It looks perfect. Thank you, Carla.
All right. Welcome to the Sustainability and Resilience series. I'm Carla Ebenbach with Ebenbach Consulting based in Miami, and I'm chair-elect of the APA Sustainable Communities Division. I'm very happy to present today's session. Before we get started, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the series and encourage you to keep attending. This series was created to provide opportunities for planning professionals to broaden and deepen their knowledge while allowing them to earn the AICP Sustainability and Resilience CM credit, either live or on demand. And we are so thankful to Christine Dorsey and the Planners Webcast series for partnering with us to bring the series to life. The series recordings are a permanent library of resources that are available for free, thanks to the dedicated efforts of fellow professionals who donate their time and expertise to make the presentations and organize the events. And now available on the YouTube playlist are a primer for planners on the basics of climate adaptation and mitigation, sessions on extreme weather trends, climate science for planners, the relationship of climate resilience to public health, technology tools, another federal funding tools session that was geared towards transit-oriented development, a session on electric vehicle infrastructure planning, supporting at-risk communities in regions that flood, and also nature-based solutions to large-scale solar. And you can follow the link, which we will put in the chat, to access any of those recordings. Today's recording will be available soon on the same platform. And there are more exciting sessions coming up with top-notch professionals this year. Next Friday, we have the Climate Planner, Strategies for Engaging on Climate When It's Challenging, with 2 seasoned practitioners from Dover Cole and Partners. You can register using the link that we'll put in the chat for that as well. That's next Friday. And then save the date for these 2 other programs scheduled for May and June that sound very exciting. And we have numerous other topics under discussion for the year. So you are about to hear Advancing Large-Scale Climate Resilient Projects Through Planning and Financing, HUD and DOT Perspectives. During today's session, we'll hear from representatives of some of this country's most significant federal agencies for large-scale community investment: the Federal Highway Administration, the Federal Transit Authority, the HUD Section 108 Loan Guarantee Program, and the HUD Office of Economic Development. These each have the capacity to make substantial and coordinated community investments, which address a variety of needs and issues simultaneously, and which can significantly boost community resilience in the face of future risks. As you'll hear, there's a strong orientation to integrating planning, engagement, and cross-disciplinary thinking in the funding programs that these agencies have created. You'll have the opportunity to ask questions, and there will be a few polling questions which will help us to get to know you better and your community's needs. So today's panelists are experts on the subject, and I'll let them introduce themselves more fully. But we are going to hear from Harlan Miller, team leader at the Federal Highway Administration, April McLean-McCoy, community planner with the pilot program for TOD at the U.S. Department of Transportation Federal Transit Authority, Seema Thomas, deputy director of the Financial Management Division of Community Planning and Development at HUD, and finally, Eric Yost, senior community planning and development specialist, also with HUD. Thank you for attending today, and Christine, I'll turn it back to you for the first polling question.
Perfect. All right. I'm going to go ahead and launch them now. It's actually a series of 5 questions. So everyone, you should see that pop up now. Panelists, I always forget if you see them or not. I don't think you do, but you should be able to see the results when we're done. So if everyone wants to go ahead and take a look at those 5 polling questions and give a couple answers, and then we'll just go over them quickly once we get everybody loaded here and just kind of gauge who's on the line. The first question is where you're joining us from, and then what organization do you represent? What is your role in the organization? What types of financing are you seeking for a particular project, if applicable? And what types of projects are most pressing for your community? So we'll give it, ooh, look at all these coming in. Good job, everybody. We'll give it another few seconds. While we're waiting for all of my panelists on the line, are there any big St. Patrick's Day events happening wherever you are? Because it's not looking good here in Cleveland. We have a big St. Patrick's Day parade, and it is pouring down rain. I don't think that's going to stop some people, but it is very unpleasant today for St. Patrick's Day parade. All right. I think I'm going to go ahead and close this up and share the results. So let's see what we've got here. Where are you joining us? Mostly, it looks like from the Midwest, and then kind of 25%. Let's see. Oh, okay. I see this. Yeah, 62% or 34%, I'm sorry, is coming from the Midwest. That's our largest group. The organization that you represent, largely local government and then private sector. Your role in the organization, it looks like subject matter expertise and then management. What types of financing are you seeking? A lot of folks aren't in that right now, but then the next largest grouping is layering it with other financial sources. And then lastly, what type of projects are most pressing for your community? And it's all of them. Planning for future projects, new infrastructure projects, projects to support rehab, improving existing infrastructure. And then lastly, no projects really in the pipeline or incremental infrastructure projects. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. And Carla, you can go ahead and share your screen again.
Okay.
And we're going to turn it over to Harlan to kick things off. And if everyone else wants to go ahead and ditch their webcam so we can focus on Harlan, we'll get started here.
Right.
Great.
Slides are coming
Hey,
up. There we go.
good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on what part of the country you reside in. Again, my name's Harlan Miller. I'm with the U.S. Department of Transportation, and within the U.S. DOT, I'm with the Federal Highway Administration. And I'm going to give some updates on the transportation planning process with a theme of equity, sustainability, climate change, and resilience, and how those things are affecting our planning process and programming processes and the availability of funding. Next slide, please. So to start with, obviously equity is a big deal. It has been for a while now. There's an executive order that came out back in 2021. And really equity is an overarching theme with what we do at the federal level, working with our state MPO and local partners. And it resonates through all the programs that I'm going to talk about. So I just wanted to share that executive order. Essentially, equity means the consistent and systematic, fair and just and impartial treatment of individuals, including individuals who belong to underserved communities that have been denied such treatment. And you can read the rest of it there, but that's kind of the basic theme with equity, is a fair treatment of traditionally underserved communities as we do our planning processes and deliver our programs. Next slide, please. Recently, Federal Highway Administration developed a screening tool related to equity. And the reason I'm sharing this is that we're encouraging states and metropolitan planning organizations and local agencies to look at equity as part of their programs, especially as it relates to transportation, since we're a transportation agency. And we developed a new screening tool. I shouldn't say new anymore. It's about 1.5 to 2 years old. It's called STEAP, S-T-E-A-P, which stands for Screening Tool for Equity Analysis of Projects. It's really geared towards MPOs and states, but it's also useful to local agencies or even members of the public or any interested person that's interested in looking at some of the equity impacts of a project. It can look at things like what's highlighted in Title VI, like race, color, national origin, also things that are to be looked at through environmental justice, like minority and low income populations and communities, limited English proficiency communities, and then disadvantaged populations, kind of consistent with the executive order we just talked about on the previous slide. This tool is really easy to use. It's available to everyone. It generates easy to use reports. Next slide, please. Essentially, when you log in and look at this tool, if you have an interest, I'm going to just share a couple screenshots so you kind of know what it is and how it works, and in case you might be interested. But when you log in, you start with a map of the United States, and we call this HEP-GIS. It's on our public facing website, Federal Highways. I'll give you a link to it in a little bit. And on the upper bar, you can see project equity analysis circled there. And that's kind of your entry into the tool. Next slide, please. And then as you enter the tool, you'll get a more detailed graphic of the United States. And again, this is just a screenshot to show you what it looks like if you were to use it. But on that tool, you can zoom into a specific region, state, or local area and do a deeper analysis on an individual highway. And you do it by, in the tool, you draw a line around the highway or corridor, or it could be a transit project too that you want to do kind of an equity screening on. And you input like a radius around the project area that you want to analyze. Next slide, please. And this is just an example run of a tool. Minnesota right now is doing some consideration of the I-94 corridor between Minneapolis and St. Paul. I forget the exact distance. This is probably a good 20-mile corridor from one end to the other that you see highlighted here. And this is just for demonstration purposes, but in the tool, there was a radius of 1 mile, which is the red area, and then a radius of 2 miles that were put in by the user. And then an analysis was run, and you can see the output of the analysis below. Next slide, please. So in that output of the tool, we'll tell you in that corridor, what are the Title VI populations in that radius around that project area by race and ethnicity, what percent is foreign born. That gives some indication of limited English proficiency and what the languages might be. But also tells you minority populations, low income, poverty, as we talk, limited English proficiency, but you can also glean other data like age and gender, education attainment, employed or unemployed, veterans, disability, and then there's characteristics on housing also that you can pull up on the structure of the housing, affordability, whether there's vehicle ownership or not, vehicle ownership, do they have computers or not, do they have internet connection or not. So very handy tool. You get access to a lot of information very quickly. It does not take long to do a run or make an analysis, but just so you know, this is available to you that as part of our equity. And as people look at projects, we encourage them to do equity screening to try to have fairness in how money is spent and looking at the impacts of, especially to traditionally underserved populations. And with that, I'm going to transition to the next slide, please. We have a ton of new programs. So when the IIJA/bill, which is the bipartisan infrastructure law, was passed back on November 15th of 2021, there's a whole host of new programs, discretionary programs. So these are programs that people can, usually state, MPO, local agency, in some cases nonprofits or universities can also apply for funds depending on the program. Each program is a little bit different, but they're all tailored. There's the common theme among all of these programs listed here of equity, sustainability, climate change, and resilience. And I'm going to just spend a few minutes. I'm not going to get in depth on any one of these programs. And I'm going to, at the end, I'll give you a website where if you want to look at any one website, or if you're interested or know somebody that's interested in submitting an application, where the applications can be made. Next slide, please. And I'm going to go through these quickly. I'm not going to go in detail, but this is one of many. The Transportation Access Pilot Program. It's a pilot program where state, MPO, or a regional planning organization or regional transportation planning organization can apply and get technical assistance from DOT on like data and analysis methods for doing an analysis of accessibility. This is like how do you analyze accessibility to whatever jobs, healthcare, employment opportunities, and kind of analyze different performance metrics and measures for accessibility to try to measure the impacts of different projects and things like that. So essentially this is what will be a program. It's not out there yet. There will be an announcement coming up. I can't tell you the exact date because it's still under development, but it will be sometime this year for technical assistance and access to data sets and help and measuring accessibility. Next slide, please. There's also the Safe Streets and Roads for All program. This has gone through one iteration of applications for 2022. There will be another one coming up here shortly for 2023, and then each year through the life of the legislation up to 2026, there'll be funding available. It's large amount of money for funding, $5 billion over 5 years, which is $1 billion per year. Eligible applications can be received from a metropolitan planning organization, a a political subdivision of a state, which really is a local government or a tribal government. So this program is oriented very specifically towards regional and local governments, not so much the states, but the local and regional governments and tribal governments, and essentially safety grants to do transportation safety planning, and with a huge emphasis also on non-motorized safety, like bicycle, pedestrian, ADA, and how they interact with the transportation system, but not limited to non-motorized. It's safety across the board related to highways. So next slide, please. So another program is the Reconnecting Communities pilot program. So back in the day when the interstate highway system was laid out, really in the 1950s and 60s and into the early 70s, there was a lot of division of neighborhoods when these facilities were constructed, and they had really damaged some of the characteristics of some of the neighborhoods. So Congress set this program up through US DOT, where states, metropolitan planning organizations, local governments, nonprofit organizations, tribal governments can apply for a grant to try to remediate some of those impacts from not only the interstate construction, but any transportation project that's caused disruption in a neighborhood or community. And it's intended to really reduce barriers to community connections, mobility, access, and economic development that may have been impacted by projects in the past. And it is a fairly large program. There's $500 million available, actually $1 billion per year available. Next slide, please. In addition, there's the PROTECT program. It's planning, resilience improvements, community resilience, and evacuation routes and at-risk coastal infrastructure. It's funded at $1.4 billion over 5 years over the life of the legislation, and it's intended to help with resilience impacts that are related to climate change, including developing, for example, resilience improvement plans for transportation, evacuation planning, preparation. But not only are the planning activities eligible, but also construction activities are eligible too, as if they're related to resilience. And it's not limited to highways. Eligible projects includes highways, transit, intercity passenger rail, port facilities. So pretty much most surface transportation is eligible. And there's very wide eligibility. It's not just the state DOTs, but also metropolitan planning organizations, local governments, special purpose transportation districts, Indian tribal governments, federal land management agencies are all eligible to apply for these grants. Next slide, please. There's also electrification as an alternative fuel source, but not only electrification, but use of hydrogen, propane, natural gas, refueling infrastructure, and electric vehicle charging infrastructure. This program is oriented towards grants to fund implementation of those activities, like electric vehicle charging stations or natural gas refueling stations. There's $2.5 billion available over the 5-year period from 2022 to 2026. Eligible applicants are, again, not just the states and metropolitan planning organizations, but local agencies can also apply, local governments, special purpose districts, Indian tribal governments. Also the territories, US territories are eligible to apply for this particular grant source. And next slide, please. I wanted to also mention, outside of the IIJA, which is the transportation legislation, that Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act here last year, and there's also some grant programs that are available through that are ending up with the US DOT and FHWA. There's the Neighborhood Access and Equity Grants program, and there's a substantial amount of money that goes with this program also. It's by application. This one's not as far along. There will be a notice of funding availability for this program at some point in the future. It's under development right now, but it's essentially for grants that to improve the walkability of communities, the safety of communities, affordable transportation access, and all through projects that are context sensitive to their locations, the neighborhoods or communities that they exist in. And it's also intended to mitigate or remediate some of the negative impacts on the human or natural environments that resulted from facilities that may have been constructed in the past. And there's also some eligibility for planning and technical capacity building activities for disadvantaged and underserved communities. So both construction and planning activities are eligible, and the pretty broad list of eligible activities: state DOTs, local agencies, political subdivisions of a state, which are really local governments, tribal governments, U.S. territories are eligible, nonprofits are eligible, so pretty broad eligibility. At some point in the future, there will be a NOFA, a Notice of Funding Opportunity, that will be issued by U.S. DOT/Federal Highway Administration, kind of soliciting requests to apply for grants with this program. Next slide, please. So this kind of sums it up on one page. There are other grant discretionary programs outside of the ones we talked about. There's a new one that I'm involved in on project selection procedures, and that one's targeted towards states and MPOs because they essentially make decisions on prioritizing how to spend funds. But we have a grant program where a state or MPO can apply for funds to develop a project selection process. And our hope is that it would incorporate the things that we're talking about, like equity and sustainability, climate change and resilience, among other things, in their decision-making process, and to even come up with that process and how to score projects and put a prioritized list together on where they're going to spend their money, is that they could apply. And that the grant limitations up to $2 million for one application under that program. We're working on a notice of funding opportunity for that program that we hope will come out later this summer. And as you can see from this chart, what I like to point out is, historically, we passed most of our federal aid funds onto the states and to a lesser extent, the metropolitan planning organizations. But with a lot of these discretionary grants now, local governments are also eligible. As you can see, those boxes checked there: Indian tribal governments, and also the federal land management agencies, in some cases, other territories of the United States. And next slide, please. And I just want to mention briefly too, that in addition to all those discretionary programs, there's some formula programs where money is doled out to each state based on a formula, and that they sort of align with the discretionary projects. However, they don't have to apply. The money is given directly and to the states. And just like there's a protect discretionary grant for planning and resilience improvements and community resilience and evacuation routes to plan and implement projects that do those things, there's also a formula program that gives states, it's funded at $7.3 billion over a 5-year period. And again, this is intended mostly for this particular program is intended mostly for the state DOTs. Next slide, please. There's also a new carbon reduction program that's also a formula program. This money goes out not only to the state DOTs, but there's also sub-allocations to areas within the state based on population. And essentially it's to provide funding for projects to reduce transportation emissions, to reduce carbon emissions, and also to do some, not only projects, but planning activities to develop some carbon reduction strategies, to put together a plan on first is how to reduce carbon emissions, and then that plan can be used to lead to projects that would also reduce carbon emissions. Next slide, please. And then also there's a formula program for national electric vehicle infrastructure implementation. So each state, which includes DC and Puerto Rico, are treated as states, receives a formula fund to have money where they can use to deploy electric vehicle charging infrastructure within the state, with the goal of creating an interconnected network of electric vehicle charging infrastructure across the nation. And there's a substantial amount of funds that go into this program too. It's funded at $5 billion across the United States over a 5-year period. Next slide, please. And then I just wanted to mention there's a huge focus on complete streets, and complete streets is really to provide a safe network of not just for vehicles, but pedestrians, transit, disabled, elderly, access to transit, access to healthcare, access to employment opportunities, things like that people can safely use their street systems to walk or bike or access transit. And essentially, when states get their planning funds and when MPOs get their planning funds, which we call state planning and research and MPO planning and research, that there's 2.5% is taken off the top, and that the states and MPOs have to use that 2.5% to do planning activity specifically for complete streets. And at the end of the process, they're to come up with a plan for complete streets that's part of their long range planning process, and then a list of funded projects that they intend to implement based on that planning process. Next slide, please. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. I did want to mention we do have a rulemaking that's underway on greenhouse gas emissions related to transportation in the national highway system. And that draft rule went out for public comment back in July of last year, July 15th. The public comment period closed in October of last year, and there's an effort now to write the final rule. So most likely sometime this year, there'll be a final rule coming out on greenhouse gas emissions. And essentially it applies to the states and metropolitan planning organizations, and it involves measuring greenhouse gas emissions related to transportation, and then establishing targets on GHG emissions, and then assessing progress towards achieving those targets, and we're kind of reporting out on progress towards greenhouse gas emissions. And it's essentially tailpipe emissions from highways as to what it applies to. Next slide, please. So you're probably asking, where can I learn more about all these different programs? Because there's a lot of them, and there's even some I didn't even talk about here. You can go to the IIJA/bill. That's where the legislation is on the bipartisan infrastructure law. We posted a bunch of fact sheets on each program that lists out all the things we talked about here, is like what's eligible, who can apply, how much money is available. The STEEP tool that we talked about on doing equity analysis, if you are interested in experimenting with that, you can go to the second link here and get access to that. And then if you're interested in grants, the thing is that each of these programs has its own cycle for grants, and there's a period for applying for them and that, but a lot of this gets posted to the US DOT Grant Navigator. So check that site out, and if you're interested in learning more about the grants and which ones are open for application and what the cycles are, and that most of them get posted to the US DOT Grant Navigator, that last link there. So that's pretty much what I have. I guess I'll wrap up, and I think our next speaker is April McCoy, and she's with the Federal Transit Administration.
Thank you, Harlan.
Carla, are you having any trouble? Oh, there we go. Perfect.
Thank you, Harlan. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is April McCoy, and I am a community planner for FTA Office of Planning and Environment, as well as the program manager for FTA's TOD pilot program. Today, I'll provide a quick overview of the program, followed by a short summary of the US DOT Build America Bureau program. Next slide, please. The TOD program is a discretionary grant program that provides funding for comprehensive and site-specific planning that supports development around transit and along corridors. These grants are competitively awarded to local communities to integrate land use and transportation planning with a new fixed guideway or core capacity improvement transit capital project. The program aims to connect communities and improve access to transit and affordable housing. This year, we will release our 8th NOFO, which stands for Notice of Funding Opportunity, and it will allow applicants to apply for TOD funding and for us to fund more opportunities across the United States. Next slide, please. The objective of the TOD program is to encourage comprehensive or site-specific TOD planning at transit stations and corridors containing eligible projects, and to support TOD planning work that goes beyond what local agencies would usually fund themselves, and to encourage partnerships that maximize chances for successful TOD implementation. Next slide. But altogether, the pillar of the TOD program is the MAP 21 statute, which states that applicants must address the standards within their planning proposals. Furthermore, each proposal submitted and approved through the program includes a maximum 80% federal funding share. For more information about eligible sources of non-federal shares, we encourage you to reference our previous NOFOs or the one that will be released later this year. But to provide you with some context today, in-kind contributions are permitted, but transportation development credits, previously referred to as toll revenue credits, do not. Details regarding pre-award authority will be provided when FTA announces the funding selections. However, lastly, I do want to mention that metropolitan transportation planning requirements also apply. So for instance, all awards must be included in MPO's UPWP, which is the Unified Planning Work Program before the applicant receives FTA funding. Next slide. Since 2014, 129 agencies have received $104 million in federal support to support TOD planning studies throughout the country. And with the appropriations of approximately $68 million through the BIL, the TOD program has expanded by 38%, which is quite significant. Next slide. In response to Executive Order 14008 and 13900, which concentrates on creating a sustainable future through federal programs, FTA has made programmatic changes through the TOD program to address these orders. This includes updating our materials so that applicants must state and provide clear evidence of how they will address climate change and sustainability in their planning proposals. And thus far, this has resulted in a substantial amount of funding to support equitable planning in EJ communities. But however, to learn about how the TOD program contributes to a greener future, I would encourage you to review FTA's Building Greener Communities through transit video on YouTube, and the link is provided at the bottom of the presentation. Next slide. In the spring of 2022, FTA created a TOD dashboard to highlight the 129 planning studies that have been awarded funding since the inception of the program in 2014. To learn more about all of these projects, please feel free to visit FTA's TOD landing page and you'll see the link to the map. Next slide. At this time, I'll touch on one of the financing options available for TOD implementation through US DOT Build America Bureau, whose mission is to provide financing and technical assistance for projects. So on the screen, you'll see there are 2 programs that can assist stakeholders with financing, including the TIFI and RIF programs that can finance certain types of public infrastructure, economic development around qualifying stations, Both programs can provide long-term, low-cost financing with fixed interest rates set at the Treasury rate. The difference between the two is that the TIFIA may finance up to 49% of project costs with a cap of 80% total federal share, while the RIF may finance up to 75% of TOD project costs with a minimum 25% non-federal share and 20% minimum private investment. Next slide. At BAB, there are multiple technical assistance programs. Some may provide direct grants, while others provide access to US DOT expertise, both in-house and through a pool of advisors. These programs each have their own purpose and focus area, but each could have a TOD nexus. For example, they can help communities explore innovative financing, partnerships, and project delivery strategies, such as land value capture, joint development, and etc. Next slide. At this time, this concludes my portion of the presentation. For more information about the program I manage, which is the TOD program, feel free to contact me at the email address that's listed on the screen. If you have further questions about the BAB, Build America Bureau program, you are welcome to contact Robert Hannafin, whose contact information is available on the screen as well. So I want to thank you so much for listening to my presentation about the TOD program, the BAB program, and I will hand the floor over to Seema from HUD to provide an overview of the HUD programs. Thank you.
Thank you, April. Hello, everyone. I'm Seema Thomas, Deputy Director for the Financial Management Division, which is located in the Office of Block Grant Assistance at HUD. So most associate HUD only with housing, but our program, Section 108, sits on the UD side of HUD, the urban development or the community development side. So our UD side team oversees and manages HUD's Section 108 Loan Guarantee Program. So this is a program that provides the equivalent of the government's full faith and credit towards projects undertaken by local governments and states. Oftentimes, they use Section 108 and its financing to fund a range of infrastructure projects with a focus on projects in underserved areas across the nation, and this can also include TOD and roads. So this has been in existence for almost 50 years. Next year, in fact, we will celebrate 50 years of our program. And HUD has played a role in the development of infrastructure from sidewalks to sanitation, anything in community development that supports the viability of communities. Next. So today what I wanted to do was provide a very brief overview, a high-level perspective of the planning process that we encourage and ask our communities and states to undertake as they think about how to use HUD's resources on the UD side. I will then go into Section 108 as it is part of a family of CDBG programs that local governments and states often use. I'll touch on how it can be combined with other sources of financing as well, and then share some resources that we have available. Next. So the consolidated housing and community development strategy. For short, this is the CON plan. I'm going to provide a very brief overview and basically how it has ties or it tries to mirror the community development strategies that are often employed by communities themselves, but it's a specific action item, it's a specific deliverable that is provided to HUD. Next. So this is a requirement as part of the broader planning process on the community planning and development. And the idea is that this will dovetail with the community's ongoing process to develop their community development strategies. Our grantees, which are often communities or states, they cannot begin spending money on activities until they've really identified their needs and corresponding priorities. We recognize that we are not able to provide enough funds, but grantees or the communities need to determine in advance how they're going to use the limited funds for strategic purposes in coordination with other community development resources. This would include our 108 program, CDBG, home, HOPWA, housing for opportunities for persons with AIDS, and emergency solutions grants. Now, after a community identifies its needs and identifies its priority investments, this would turn into what we call the consolidated plan. And the basic idea is that this consolidated plan, CON plan, would align these financial resources from HUD, and it would have the overarching goal of improving the quality of life at the local level. A hallmark of the program is that the consolidated plan must go through a required citizen participation process, and this oftentimes mandates a public hearing and different opportunities for public comment on draft plans. Next. So now just to touch on some of the mechanics of Section 108, and that's the program that we manage, but it is part of a suite of other programs offered through the Community Development Block Grant Program. Next. So our program has been around since the 1970s. Very soon we will cross the 10 billion milestone, the threshold. We have worked with over 600 communities, and it's had many different types of community impacts, from jobs, improved public works, infrastructure, and even better housing. The key takeaway from this infographic to bear in mind is that for every dollar of Section 108 financing, communities have been able to secure almost $5 of additional funds. And we find that to be very important because an important part of this program is that it is a loan guarantee. So it is where the federal government is putting its full faith and credit behind projects, particularly risky projects where other financing may not be enticed to go. Next. So as I mentioned earlier, our program, along with other programs like CDBG, disaster recovery, is part of the Community Development Block Grants family of programs. And the idea of these block grants is to provide a grant to over 1,234 grantees with a grant based on a formula that's determined yearly. Last year, the appropriation was over $3 billion, where approximately 30% went to states and 70% went to cities. The primary goal for this is to expand economic opportunities and improve living conditions for communities, primarily for low and moderate income persons. Next. So Section 108 is part of this family of programs. It uses the same chassis, but one key distinction is that it is not a grant. It is a loan guarantee. However, it is a non-competitive loan guarantee, and it allows communities and states to access lower interest rates. It uses the programmatic framework of the CDBG program, but because it is non-competitive, our team can provide unlimited one-on-one technical assistance that's needed for a project. Next. One of the key aspects that communities need to bear in mind is that any eligible activity must meet at least one of 3 national objectives. The one we most commonly see is benefit to low and moderate income persons, but it can also be used for elimination of blight. Under some exceptional cases, it can be used for urgent need, but we tend to see that more with CDBG disaster recovery projects. Next. So in terms of the types of projects 108 can be used for, it falls under 4 buckets: economic development, housing, public facilities, and infrastructure. But within that, communities have quite a range of what they can do. And again, this is just illustrative. It's not comprehensive by any means, but it's just to give you a sense of how communities can be creative with their financing and combine different types of community goals into one project. Next. And also bear in mind that 108 can be used for varying scales of a project. So it can be used for a project that might be more incremental in nature to something more transformational for a community. We have done 108s as small as 30,000 to something as large as hundreds of millions. So again, we mirror the needs of the communities depending on what they need. Next. So in terms of who has access to the funds, as I mentioned before, there are 1,234 eligible entities to receive these funds, and these primarily include entitlement communities. These are cities greater than 50,000 or counties greater than 200,000, and states. And states can be a pass-through vehicle where they can pass the money to smaller units of local government. Next slide. But within that, there are many different arrangements. So the funds can go to subrecipients, they can be relent to third-party developers, and it doesn't necessarily have to be one arrangement. It can be a series of different types of arrangements with communities. Next. In terms of how much communities can take, they would take their CDBG grant allocation, they would multiply it by 5, and that would be the upper limit of how much they could take in a 108. Of course, we would subtract out any existing commitments that exist, and you would get your final number. And we have those resources available, those actual figures, on our website on HUD Exchange. Next. So just to briefly mention two types of requirements to bear in mind, the programmatic side and the financial side. I'll just give you a very brief overview. Next slide. So as I mentioned, it has to meet one of the national objectives, one being benefit to low and moderate income persons, or the second one being for the elimination of blight. It has to be an eligible activity. If it's an economic development activity, it has to meet what we call public benefit standards. So a certain number of jobs are created with the funds. And then finally, federal cross-cutting requirements, where all federal projects are subject to. Next. And because it's a loan, communities also need to think about how they will repay the loan, collateral that they might use for the loan, and then think about different underwriting concerns as well. Next. Oftentimes, communities use CDBG, parking revenue, tax increment financing revenue, and just a whole host of sources can be used to repay it. The primary collateral is the pledge of future and current CDBG. However, there is no set aside. It's only a pledge. It's not actually used unless the community chooses to. And then there's the secondary source of collateral that is also required. And again, there's quite a bit of flexibility on the types of collateral that a community can designate for this. Next. So in terms of the process, a community would put forward a project. They would seek public comment for it. They would submit the application both to headquarters and the field office. They would seek approval for this project, and then the financing could come in, and then the community would have 20 years for administration of the project. Next. And then just to give you a sense of the flow of funds, again, this is just a very high level view, more to illustrate that HUD is actually not the lender, but more the guarantor. Here we work with the fiscal agent, Bank of New York Mellon, who actually facilitates the funds going to the borrower, and then repayment is actually made to Bank of New York Mellon. When working with HUD, though, it will look like HUD is the lender. Next slide. And then here, this is just to illustrate, to give you the community's perspective of how the loan financing would look like if they were to work with a third-party developer. They would give then the funds to the third-party developer and seek repayment, possibly with a spread on top. Next. So there are many different advantages of using 108. It can be used as a match if federal funds are permitted. There's unlimited technical guidance that can be provided. The funds are non-competitive, available year-round, and it is quite flexible. Next slide. Next slide. So here we wanted to talk about how we often see 108 combined with other types of financing. And this is important because for transformational projects, oftentimes we'll see that it's combined, layered with other types of financing. And then in some cases, if the project has moved forward, it's used as but-for financing, financing that helps a community move past its pain point to get the project moving. In some cases, it's also used as seed financing, where the HUD guarantee is used to send a signal for other financing to flow in. And then for very simpler projects where there's very low risk or not necessarily many other factors that need to be involved, we see it used as standalone financing. Next slide. And as you heard my colleagues earlier from DOT, we often see our funds combined with other federal sources of financing, everyone from DOT, EPA, FEMA, NPS with their historic tax credits as well. Next slide. So here, this is my favorite part. I just wanted to give just a quick snapshot of a few projects just to give you a sense of how communities have been creative with how they've used our funds. Next slide. And to preface that, communities can use our financing for 2 stages, primarily for preparation and pre-development, all the way to the implementation phase. So for communities, this can mean an eligible activity is acquisition, demolition, remediation, all the way to the actual public site improvements and infrastructure that's needed. Next. So here, this project is based in the city of Los Angeles. It is an extremely sustainable TOD site. It has LEED Gold certification. This is near a very large transit hub of the San Fernando Valley, located approximately a block away. And it was an interesting example because it used both adaptive reuse and mixed use as its two aspects that it wanted to flag as being a LEED Gold project. This project was a job generator of creating almost 400 jobs for the nearby community and its residents. Next slide. So this is another project in Denison, Texas. According to the American Community Survey, over 50% of the residents there were low and moderate income households. And here they took 108 to accelerate the timeline that they had in mind to improving their roads. The community there took out a 108 so they could amortize it across 20 years. And they were able in the process also to incorporate some elements of sustainability by recycling some of the products in the process as they resurfaced the roads as well. Next slide. Here, again, as I mentioned, we also do very small projects. We often see CDBG and Section 108 used for micro-mobility type projects. Here's a local sidewalk improvement example out of Winchester, Virginia. They had been using CDBG prior to this every year, expanding, improving sidewalks on a yearly basis, and they decided to take the plunge and take a 108 so they could do a far bigger scale of projects. In particular, they wanted to have better sidewalks for their elderly community that lived within its boundaries. Next slide. And then this is another project out of Merced, where they used the 108 to build a solar canopy for a parking site near an affordable housing complex. And they also used the 108, envisioned using the 108 for electric vehicle charging stations as well. And this would be a project that would be constructed in accordance with California's Green Energy Code. Next slide. And just shifting gears to water, because we do work in the space of water, we've seen communities use 108 to extend water lines. This is an example out of Brevard County, where some of the homes, a subset of the homes had high levels of arsenic and lead. So the city there expanded one of their water lines and in the process added fire safety, a layer of fire safety protection by adding it's escaping me at the moment, fire hydrants. Next slide. And then this project in Meriden, Connecticut is quite exciting because the community here combined 3 community goals into one. They addressed remediation, they put in flood control infrastructure, and finally, they created much needed park space for its nearby residents. There had been an old abandoned silver factory that needed remediation with the site, including demolition, and then they had experienced periodic flooding. So now the community had put in infrastructure that would protect it against a 100-year storm. Next. So we have a few resources that are available. On the next slide, we can go to the next. Our go-to place is HUD Exchange. It has everything from the borrowing capacity, the application tool, everything that you would need to know. And then also, please know that we are available for technical guidance if needed. On the next slide, we have the different ways that we help communities think through some of these larger infrastructure projects and any project in general that impacts community development. Of course, 108 is one of the tools in the community development toolbox, and there are others, and we're happy to try to link to the other HUD programs as needed. Next slide. Here's my contact information. Please feel free to contact me. Also, there is the site for HUD Exchange as well, if it's needed. And now I will pass to my colleague at HUD, Eric Yost from the Office of our DAS for Economic Development.
Thank you so much, Seema, and thank you for the other speakers for the presentations, and I'm glad to be with you all today on St. Patrick's Day. So what I would like to do first is introduce myself. I'm Eric Yost. I work in HUD's Office of the DAS, which is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic Development. In the Office of the DAS for Economic Development, we have various departments and programs, which I'll share with you today. So the key topics that we're going to discuss on the next slide in the session is I will give you an overview of the role of the DAS for Economic Development. We will cover in a little more detail some of the key planning documents that are integral to this work across the federal government, from the White House to HUD's planning documents. So talking about, as Harlan had shared, Executive Order 1.0, but also the recent equity, which I'll call 2.0 executive order. Talk about the Domestic Policy Council's urban equitable development work, and really discussing this definition of equitable development and sustainability and how they are being defined and working together or not. And then we'll go into some of the key tools and resources through HUD strategic planning efforts and climate action planning and resilience toolkits that are available, followed by some technical assistance opportunities, and to leverage additional grant opportunities or programs that HUD has available for these activities. Next slide, please. So the Office of the DAS for Economic Development is a department within, or an office within, the Office of Community Planning and Development at HUD. We have two offices within the Office of the DAS for Economic Development: an Office of Economic Development and an Office of Rural Housing and Economic Development. Within our Office of Economic Development, we have what is known as the Congressional Grants Division. The Congressional Grants Division is responsible for the $4.5 billion portfolio of community project funding grants that Congress reinstituted after a 12-year hiatus for the last 2 fiscal years, also known potentially as earmarks. Next slide, please. So what is the role of the Office of the DAS for Economic Development? Our key 3 roles in the Office of the DAS for Economic Development are really to position equitable economic opportunity aligned to the administration's priorities and to HUD's strategic plans and goals around economic opportunity for low-income residents and small businesses in underserved communities. Second key focus of our department and office is to foster place-based initiatives. We've been the home for several of the designs and implementation of place-based initiatives, but partnering with other federal agencies around these efforts that are collective response models designed in places to foster comprehensive community and economic opportunities and revitalization. The third key area is we work to align internal efforts to create strong local economies with those of our federal partners. So working in strong collaboration with many of our federal partners for interagency coordination. Next slide, please. So just going in a little bit deeper into the key areas of what we do in the Department of the DAS, or the Office of the DAS for Economic Development. We have several key grants and initiatives and programs that we foster and work with, and I had shared some of them before, grant programs, but also, as I mentioned, the community project funding grants or economic development initiative grants. We work on new place-based initiatives and developing that community of practice for learning and leveraging place-based initiatives. We also have internal working groups that we foster and support around place-based initiatives and economic opportunity, both in rural places, but overall in HUD's footprints across the country. And then we work in and support many of the White House Domestic Policy Council interagency policy committees, of which I'll touch on 2 of them today: the Rural Prosperity Interagency Policy Committee or Council and the Urban Equitable Development IPC. In addition, we work with several of our federal partners around key areas like thriving communities, with our HUD-assisted housing on Superfund sites, so with our partners at EPA, HHS, and others, working with HHS and FEMA on equitable long-term recovery and resilience planning, and a recent recently formed, sitting and working in partnership with FEMA on the Resilience Place-Based Task Force and other efforts with DOT around coordinating council on access and mobility. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of background as well is this department at HUD tends to ebb and flow with administrations for their priorities. We have been the home for the Partnership for Sustainable Communities, which some have worked on in the past in prior administrations, the Sustainable Communities Initiative, Strong Cities, Strong Communities, Promise Zones, and then we are working on and supporting and designing new place-based initiatives. Next slide, please. So I'm going to turn to kind of the top level, and then we'll work our way down into how federal executive orders, especially around equity, impact and have ramifications all the way through the various planning documents at HUD and how then they become part of our programs and policies. You know, this work is done both upward and downward and how this works together, but this might give you some framework of how the effects of executive orders to our agency strategic planning documents and how these kind of tie and roll together. So as Harlan had mentioned, the very first executive order signed by President Biden on the first day of office was Executive Order 13985, which was advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government. And this executive order is pretty significant in the fact that it caused a rollout and ramifications across the federal government for how we're going to address equity and serve our underserved communities. This is just a quick highlight of the first section of the policy on that, and I'll go into more detail on this and the others following this slide. Next slide, please. So, flash forward to 2023, Executive Order 14091, which we are calling President Biden's Equity 2.0 Executive Order, was signed February 22nd. When I started these slides, it was the most recent executive order, but there has been one subsequent to it. So just thinking of the first executive order being 1.0, and then this being the most recent other than one other executive order. But this one is focused on further advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government. Again, it references that initial first day of office, first signed executive order to support underserved communities through the federal government and what we were charged with in addressing and advancing equity for the federal government to support and empower Americans, including many communities that have been underserved, discriminated against, and adversely affected by persistent poverty and inequality, and how we are going to deliver the federal resources, grants, programs, and benefits equitably to the people in the United States to help rebuild trust in government. Next slide, please. So in the most recent Executive Order 14091, what's really important is to take a look at all the other executive orders not only referenced, but that have happened in between these two bookends of the Equity 1.0 executive order and the Equity 2.0 executive order. So here you'll see a list of various executive orders, not only reference, but build upon that initial executive order that are also in contribution to and support the Equity 2.0 executive order. And these have been occurring, as you can see, over the course of January of 2021, throughout much of 2021, but are still in effect. And you can see this covers everything from ethics commitments for executive branch personnel to climate crisis at home and abroad, how to address, to gender policy, advancing equity, justice and opportunity for different parts of our community, like Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders, and also preventing and combating discrimination for other groups, as well as legislative actions on advancing equity for Hispanics, Native Americans, Black Americans, etc. Next slide, please. So what are the key parts of this Executive Order 2.0? So here you'll see the different sections of this, and I'm going to be diving into particular sections around how we're defining equitable development and how we're including sustainability in those efforts. Next slide, please. So section 2, which is establishing an equity-focused leadership across the federal government, charges our federal government agencies within 30 days of this recent executive order to ensure that we have agency equity teams within all our federal agencies that are focused on this coordination and implementation of the equity initiatives. And it established a White House steering committee on equity. Second, section 3, on delivering equitable outcomes through government policies and programs, basically stated that the steering committee will include actions in these other executive orders. Next slide, please. Section 6 talks about the rural commitments and rural communities, and then there was another section I'll share about urban areas within Section 6. So the first is this effort to undertake and to the extent possible to help rural communities to identify resources and commitments around technical assistance, creating good paying jobs, research, and outreach, as well as aligning resources to a new interagency place-based initiative called the Rural Partners Network. Next slide, please. So the Rural Partners Network is led by the Domestic Policy Council and the U.S. Department of Agriculture Rural Development, but with support from 22 federal agencies, of which HUD is a part. And this work is focused on rural communities to help them to both secure funding and resources to create jobs, build infrastructure, and support long-term economic stability. Next slide, please. In addition, in Section 6 of the Executive Order 2.0, it says that agencies shall undertake efforts to the extent, consistent with law, of course, that's going to be in there, to strengthen urban equitable development policies and practices. And this includes areas such as community wealth building practices, preventing physical and economic displacement as a result of our investments, kind of facilitating the flow also of private capital, and incorporating metrics into the design and deployment of our grants and programs. And to support this activity, what's really critical is there will be a policy memorandum on actions agencies can take to advance urban equitable development. Should be out any day. So stay tuned for that. It may be out today, I don't know, but didn't see it this morning. So stay tuned. Next slide, please. So part of this effort for that particular aspect of the memorandum is that the Domestic Policy Council created an Urban Equitable Development IPC. The focus of that is to work on the full suite of federal funding rules and regulations around this community wealth building and working on that executive order and the memorandum. Next slide, please. So a lot of this goes to how do we define equitable development? The urban planner, Carlton Ely, has a quote here: an approach to meet the needs of underserved communities and individuals through projects, programs, or policies that reduce disparities while fostering places that are healthy, vibrant, and diverse. Next slide. Also, our partners at the Environmental Protection Agency have a definition that closely follows that definition. And you can see in their definition, it includes innovative design strategies and sustainable policies that acknowledge and understand that it's necessary for sustaining environmental justice. HUD does not have a single definition for equitable development, but we also do define equitable development in various grants and programs that closely follow these definitions and the key of how sustainability then incorporates into the concept of equitable development. Next slide, please. So how does sustainability then flow through HUD's grants and programs? HUD's mission includes the term sustainability and sustainable efforts. So HUD's mission is to create strong, sustainable, inclusive communities, and this includes building inclusive and sustainable communities free from discrimination as well. Next. So we also have a strategic plan that we issued in 2022 that focuses on the years of 2022 to 26. In that strategic plan, we have 4 key goals around grants and programs. Strategic goal 1, which is to support underserved communities. I'll dive into that in a bit, but there's a section on investing in success of communities. In our strategic goal 3, that's focused on promoting home ownership, we have a significant priority for 3A, which is to advance sustainable home ownership. And in strategic goal 4 is around advancing sustainable communities that dives really into the efforts of climate resilience and other environmental justice efforts we're taking at HUD around building sustainable communities. Next slide. Other key documents to reference in addition to the strategic plan is our fiscal year 23 annual performance plan that will be in effect through the end of September 2023. And just this week, we published our annual performance plan for fiscal year 24 with a reflection on our performance of 2022. Next slide, please. So just looking at a few key documents in section strategic objective 1C, which is focused on the invest in the success of our communities. You can see here that incorporates a series of strategies around how we're going to promote equitable community development, going to that equitable development definition that generates wealth building for underserved communities. Next slide. In addition, strategic goal 3 around promoting home ownership, as I mentioned, has some key areas, of which on the next slide, you'll see is to advance sustainable communities with 3 key goals on investing in climate resilience and carbon reduction, strengthen environmental justice, and increase healthcare and housing. Next slide, please. Here are some additional details about strategic objective 4A at HUD and the efforts around investing in climate resilience, energy efficiency, and renewable energy across HUD programs. You'll see in our strategic plan and goals, additional milestones, data, grants, programs. So I highly recommend people take a look at our fiscal year 24 strategic plan to see where all these grants, resources, and efforts are going to be aligned and when certain things are going to be accomplished. Next slide, please. Again, some additional details on 4B, which is strengthening environmental justice around reducing exposure to health risks, environmental hazards, and substandard housing, especially for low-income households and communities of color. This effort is led by our Office of Lead Hazard Control and Healthy Homes. Next slide. In addition, I wanted to share just a little bit about strategic goal 1, which is to support underserved communities in our strategic plan. On the next slide, you will see also that we have a climate action plan that was issued in November 2021. This gives you an overview of the planning document and action plan that includes the 3 key goals of increasing climate resilience, reducing greenhouse gas pollution, and pursuing environmental justice. Next slide, please. Another tool that was recently released in January of 2023 is our Community Resilience Toolkit. This gives you an idea of the various components of the toolkit in the table of contents of the areas that we cover under resilience. Next slide, please. And here's just a visual, one of the visuals within that toolkit to how can natural hazard risks affect a community in the various aspects of the toolkit. Next slide. And then what does a resilient community look like? So we cover these different areas, different aspects of the areas in our toolkit and how to address them, how different grants and programs at HUD can contribute to reducing and making more resilient communities and climate resilient communities. Next slide, please. In addition, in the guide, and goes to much of the topics to discuss today, there's a section on funding resilience actions that also includes how our Office of Community Planning and Development funding can result in resilience actions through various grants and programs, such as my colleague Seema mentioned, community development block grants, and our Section 108 program. So, and as well as other funding opportunities available within HUD, such as our Choice Neighborhoods program and other programs to support resilience. Next slide, please. Finally, I wanted to mention some technical assistance opportunities. HUD recently released the Thriving Communities Technical Assistance that's available for local governments to receive technical assistance in a variety of areas to support underserved communities with investment in infrastructures with unlocking land for housing development. This is a new technical assistance opportunity, so I would like to refer you to that site to take a look at it. Next slide. Lastly, HUD's grants and programs are located on our website, in addition to past notices, but grants.gov is where we post available opportunities. Next slide. And here's my contact information. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you. Let's go ahead and jump into a few questions with our 10 minutes remaining here. So if everyone wants to throw their webcams back on, I'm just going to go ahead and dive right in. This first question, let's see here. How does the Federal Transit Administration address Executive Order 14008, the Justice 40 requirement within the TOD program?
Thank you so much for the question. That is actually a great question. For the TOD program, one of the ways in which we address Executive Order 14008 is by including the components of the executive order in all of our program documents, as well as analyzing the projects that we are funding or the planning studies that we are funding according to what's set forth in the executive order. So to conclude, altogether, we do make sure that we are addressing climate change, that the applicants are mentioning strategies for addressing climate change in their planning documents, as well as in a supplemental form that is released for each NOFO. There is language that does focus on Executive Order 14008, and to ensure that everyone is in alignment with that executive order, we do assess all of the applications according to that statute. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question. How is the DOT's equity tool different from Biden's CGS tool and other federal agencies? Does it include single head of household?
So yeah, it does include household characteristics such as single head of household based on census data, and I think that's a good point. Other federal agencies do also have tools, including the administration, and I think the CGS tool has a climate change orientation to it and has data layers related to areas that are susceptible to climate change, which the STEEP tool does not have that particular benefit to it. So depending on what types of things you're trying to do analysis on, you might want to look at these other tools. The STEEP tool is very oriented towards the underserved communities that are in proximity to transportation projects, but not necessarily highlighting if it's in a climate change area or not, or area susceptible to climate change issues, which that would be the CGS tool.
How is STEEP different from the EPA's EJ screen?
Yeah, and that's another good example. The EPA has the EJ screen tool, which serves a similar purpose to the STEEP tool. EPA's tool includes a lot of environmental indicators like air quality emissions, particulate matter, ozone, underground storage tanks, or Superfund sites. So if a person wants to do an analysis that looks at susceptibility to a region to those types of environmental concerns, then the EPA's tool would be the best tool to use. And where again, the STEEP tool that DOT has, Federal Highways, is more oriented to proximity to EJ and Title VI populations in a project.
Okay, couple questions regarding the HUD section 108. We talked about one-on-one technical assistance. What does that look like in practice?
Sure. So for a community, if they have interest in a project, we encourage them to come and speak either to the field office or our program here at headquarters early on, because there are many considerations that a community might need to consider before undertaking a project, particularly different types of financing that might be involved, and just thinking about eligibility. And basically, it's unlimited technical assistance. We can work with developers if the community is present, the government is present there as well too, on putting together their application and connecting them to other communities that may have done similar projects. Even after the 108 is approved and they're in implementation mode, we understand that market conditions change and they may need to change how their payment plan, their repayment structure, and other aspects from collateral and other factors. So we're always willing to work with communities, and we understand the need for flexibility.
One more question regarding section 108, and I guess we're kind of hopping backwards here. So how do we identify the best counterpart or partner in local government to assess the funding for a HUD section 108?
Sure. So the CDBG administrator in each community or state is the primary point of contact. That being said, designated public agencies can also seek a Section 108, but it would require coordination with the CDBG administrator because they would be putting CDBG funds as primary collateral.
Thank you. Next question. What types of funding opportunities exist from the DOT? Are there any new initiatives that we should know about?
Yeah, so there is a whole host of discretionary projects that are out there. We talked about quite a few of them today, and a wide range of eligible applicants to those programs. I did provide a link there. If a person wants to check out what those programs are, go to that US DOT Navigator site. You can check out all the programs that are available.
High level, how are funding decisions made?
Sure. There's a couple processes. A lot of it happens through state DOTs and metropolitan planning organizations that put together the list of funded programs. And that's for the traditional formula funded programs. Decisions are made for transportation projects, highways, and transit. And of course, the transit agencies are part of that process too, and there's public engagement. But for the discretionary projects, it happens a little bit different. The traditional agencies are often eligible, but the local governments and nonprofits and certain categories of those discretionary projects also have the ability to apply and compete for those projects. That's really outside of the traditional decision-making process.
Okay, we're gonna hop back for, I think, one more question on Section 108 again. Could you tell us what is the best way to use Section 108? A good example.
So there is no one way to use it. I think it depends on the community's needs. And I think that's consistent for all our programs. I think quite a bit of it depends on the community, but I think right now we're in this moment where communities have this large influx of funds and programs. So it's an opportune time to think about transformational projects, hopefully projects that can combine multiple community goals. And it requires coordination across all the different departments as well, as we're trying to do here among ourselves between HUD and DOT as well. But I don't believe there's one way.
Okay. I think we're going to wrap up here. I see 2:30 on my clock. Thank you everyone for joining us today. This was a really good round robin of all of these great resources, and I loved it. And of course, thank you to the joint division effort to put on this series. A couple quick reminders. Don't forget to check out our recordings on our YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/planningwebcast. And you'll also see a specific playlist for the SNR series if you're interested. Register for our upcoming sessions, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And don't forget to log those CM credits today. All the information you need, if you can't find them, is at ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. So thanks everyone for joining us today. Have a good weekend, stay safe, and we'll talk next time. Thank you.